we're studying the story in the Chumash, and what is emerging, and of course it's not emerging because that's what I'm teaching you, it's emerging because that's what the Rebbe is teaching. And it's based, of course, on Chazal and on Sfarim and even on Psukim. That Golos Mitzrayim is Yerida Achar Yerida. The exile in Egypt is a descent, and then another descent, and possibly a third descent. And Yetzias Mitzrayim is Aliyah Acharei Aliyah. The exodus from Egypt is an ascent, and then a second descent, and so forth. The first descent is when they came to Egypt in the first place. These were Jewish people who were very holy, who had lived in the Holy Land, who brought the Holy Land Spirit with them to Egypt. So it was considered exile simply because they were outside of the Holy Land. And then they died. When they died, that Spirit died with them. And what was left was a nation of Jews, their children, their descendants, who had never lived in the Holy Land, never knew that Spirit, who now were vulnerable to Egypt physically. In other words, they could have been enslaved. And they also were vulnerable to Egypt spiritually. They were vulnerable to Egypt because the Egyptian culture was idolatrous. The Egyptians worshipped the river, the Nile. And as I explained to you in the previous week, and the Rebbe actually has it here in our Sichos, if I can bother you to look on page 14, the second paragraph from the bottom is in a bracket, which I did not underline. I'm just going to read it to you. In Eretz Yisrael, they relied on rain. What you need to rely on rain is akel, telim, einayim, klape maila. You raise your eyes upwards. Right? The clouds are in the sky. Mefilt adas is totally in the Meibishten, and symbolically this means that you appreciate your dependency upon God. Masha'enken when the Nilus, as opposed to when you live in a land where there is no rain, and instead you live from the river, the Nile, is Eilu Mashke, rises up and irrigates, that means floods, is Nitnike, the Ophengigkeit from the Meibishten. You don't see evidence of the dependency upon God. In other words, in Eretz Yisrael, the land itself was susceptible to God. In Mitzrayim, the land itself was susceptible to idolatrous philosophies. Because in Egypt, their source of life came from the ground. In Israel, the source of life came from the mountains and from the sky. So when the generation of Jews who had lived in the Holy Land died, and what was left were their descendants who had never lived in the Holy Land, they were very vulnerable to the new philosophy, to the new culture, which said, where do you live? From the earth. There is no God in heaven, there's just God on earth. He's called the river the Nile, and that's what they worshipped. And of course this is what happened. They were enslaved not only physically, they were enslaved spiritually. The Jewish people were not only physically destroyed, they were spiritually crushed. They became so immersed in idolatrous ways of the Egyptians that the Chazal say, Halolu evdi aved zora, v'halolu evdi aved zora. These were idolatrous, and these were idolatrous. You couldn't tell a Jew from an Egyptian in terms of his religious beliefs. They were totally caught up in that way of life. So the slavery happened, right? They came to Egypt with their ancestors, as long as their ancestors lived, even though it was exile, but it was with the spirit of Exile, and then they died. Yaakov died, Yosef died, Reuven died, Shimon died. The last one to die is Levi. And when Levi dies, it's over. And the Jewish people collectively fall to a level where even if they were going to believe in God, they were much more subject to laws of nature, and they became pagan. They lost their association with God Almighty. In addition, they were enslaved and they were treated terribly. And after being in Egypt for 210 years, after being enslaved for 86 years, which had started 30 years before when Levi had died, out of the wilderness comes Moshe Rabbeinu. And the thing that's so interesting about Moshe Rabbeinu, which we talked about last week, and I always was bothered by this, I couldn't understand this, that Moshe is the Jewish Redeemer. He never suffered. Never. It's not fair. It's just not fair. It's not fair. Stamp your foot and scream, not fair. It's not fair. Aaron and Miriam gave their blood for their brothers and sisters. They were their shepherds. Aaron and Miriam, right? Moshe's older brother, Moshe's older sister. I told you their name Miriam means mar, bitter. because of the bitterness that ensued when she was born, they were there and they watched the worst atrocities happen to the Jewish people for 86 years, and then the younger brother comes out of nowhere and says, okay, I'm in charge now, you can all work for me. And the beautiful part of the story was that, okay, we'll be happy to work for you, you take charge, tell us what to do. The Chumash describes Moshe Rabbeinu saying, how could you do this to Aaron? How could you do this to Aaron? And Hashem says to Moshe, you don't know your brother. He'll be thrilled to let you take the role. He'll be very happy to work for you, rather than work directly for me. And that's exactly what happens in Chumash and Parshas Shmos, later in the Parsha. So the Rebbe told us last week that it has to be that way. It just has to be that way. The Redeemer needs to be above the exile. In fact, one of the little interesting nuances of Moshe Rabbeinu's life is that his mother was not conceived in Egypt, she was conceived in Israel. In other words, Moshe Rabbeinu, the koyach that Moshe needed to be able to be the Jewish Redeemer was not only that he never suffered in the exile of Egypt, he needed to have a link to the Holy Land, to before the Jewish people left. So his mother became pregnant with his mother. Moshe Rabbeinu's mother was conceived in Eretz Yisrael. And she is called Bas Levi. She's not identified by name. Yocheved is mentioned many places in Chumash. But when Moshe Rabbeinu was born, his mother is not referred to as Yocheved. She's referred to as the daughter of Levi. Because it's that link that allows her to be the mother of the Jewish Redeemer. So there's a very interesting piece of the story here, that what qualifies Moshe Rabbeinu to be the Redeemer of the Jewish people is that he's above the exile. And if you recall, I told you some stories of more recent times, and how I interpreted those stories. I'll repeat this quickly now, because I spent some time in a previous class delving into this at length. The Rebbe Rashab was living in Rostov in the winter of 1920 when the Bolsheviks arrived, the communists arrived. If you know the story, the Bolsheviks made a revolution in Leningrad. Leningrad is in the Baltic Sea, which is the very top of Russia. Rostov is in the Black Sea, which is the very bottom of Russia. It's in the River Don. It's very close to the Black Sea. And there was a civil war with not two factions, but with 3 or 4 factions who were all killing each other, and the only common enemy that they all had was Jews. They killed so... Nobody has any ideas. It's one of the parts of Jewish history that no one even talks about. The number of Jews who were killed in the Russian Revolution. Somebody told me the other night, I was in Long Island, that he did research that only one of those factions killed 150,000 Ukrainian Jews. And there's no monument to them, there's no right, there's nothing. There's nothing. And that's just one group in one part of Russia. We have no idea how many pogroms there were and how many Jews were killed. It was terrible. Terrible. Anyway, the Bolsheviks arrived in Rostov 3 years later, 1920, the winter of 1920. The revolution happened in November of 1917, and they arrived in Rostov during the winter of Tafresh Pei, 1920, 1919, 1920, January, February, Christmas. As soon as they showed up in town, the Rebbe Rashab said, and I quote, I cannot cohabit with them, I can't live with them. Now there's an identical quote from the Rebbe Rashab's great-grandfather and namesake, the Mittler Rebbe, whose name was Dov Ber, that when the decree of the Cantonists started, that they would take children away for 25 years of slave labor, he said, Ich ken das nit. I can't do it. He went to his father's kever, the Alter Rebbe, and he prayed, and he came out, and he said, my father freed me from the Rabbonis, and guess what he did? He died at the age of 54. So the Rebbe Rashab did exactly the same thing. He said, I can't do this. I can't live with them. Ich ken mit seinen Einem. And that's what he did. He passed away. There's a story that went around Lubavitch, and it may even be a true story, but it's certainly a beautiful story. I think there's a record of the story. There's a document for this story. And I'm wasting your time, right? The Rebbe, when I was growing up, the Rebbe never, ever, ever put on new shoes. As long as I remember the Rebbe, the same pair of shoes. The shoes were so torn up. There was mamish. It was a miracle that they were there. There's pictures of the Rebbe. The photographers were kind not to show the Rebbe's shoes. But in the 70s, the shoes were ripped. He never put on new shoes. The shoes were terrible. He probably put the shoes on in 1970 or 71. He wore them till 1990. He wore the same pair of shoes for 20 years. So I heard from a person who was very close to the Rebbetzin the Rebbe's wife, that he came to the Rebbe and said, the Rebbe doesn't want to get new shoes. His shoes are falling apart. So she said that when the Rebbe goes to the Oihel, they should take the shoes to the shoemaker and get a very, very soft piece of black leather and put it on the inside of the shoe. In other words, the entire, not the heels were torn, the soles were gone. There was no shoe. There was no shoe left. Nothing. Mamish, the Rebbe's shoes were they were not even slippers. It was a disaster. And the Rebbe wore these shoes in the snow. So Chaim Baruch said, he's on himself, and he's taking the Rebbe's shoes. So the Rebbe's secretary, Rabbi Groner, says, where are you going with the shoes? He said, well, I had a conversation with the Rebbitzin, and the Rebbitzin said, when the Rebbe goes to the oil, they have a few hours, take him to the shoemaker will fix him immediately and bring him back. So Rabbi Groner says to Chaim Baruch, you have word from the Rebbitzin. I'm just telling you that you're playing with fire. Because every single time for 20 years, when the Rebbe came back from the oil, he asked, same shoes? Every single time he came back from the oil, he said, you didn't change my shoes? You didn't change my shoes? So Chaim Baruch went back to the Rebbe's wife, to the Rebbe, who was the only person who could have pulled this off, and said, Rabbi Groner says that I'm playing with fire. And he tells her what he said. So the Rebbe said, you shouldn't have asked me. You should have fixed the shoes. But now you can't fix them. So the shoes were never fixed. So we grew up with the Rebbe with torn shoes, and we always understood that the Rebbe wore torn shoes because his feet hurt him. The Rebbe suffered terribly with his feet. The Rebbe always made an effort to walk very dignified and very quickly, but his feet were in constant pain. So we always knew the Rebbe wore torn shoes because the torn shoes hurt his feet. And then one fine day in 1990, he got brand new shoes. Allah, his feet stopped hurting. I remember the new shoes. We couldn't believe it. They put on new shoes. So there was a story that went around at the time, and again, I think it's actually true. That this, go back, this is 1989, 1990, go back to 1920, or 1919, that when the Bolsheviks came into Rostov, and the Rebbe Rashab said, I cannot live with them, and then he would very quickly pass away. He was a completely healthy man, totally healthy man. He fabreng Purim, he trashed the communists, I'll get to that soon. He spent a whole week writing a will. Took him a week to write his will. His will was very long, very scholarly. As soon as he finished writing the will, he got sick. 1 week later, he was gone. Mamish, if you read the story, this man Pashat wrote his own ticket. The Rebbe Rashab, the previous Rebbe's father.
The Bolsheviks are the communists.
Yeah, of course. So the story was that when he said that statement, I can't live with them, there's more words. And he spoke in Yiddish. Sevetamol kumen a junger man mit zerrissene Schiech wird sie herabwaschen. You understood the German? One day a young man will come with torn shoes and he will throw them off. Now in Yiddish, and probably in German also, herabwaschen can mean two things. He will throw off his shoes and he will throw off the communists. So the Rebbe Rashab said in 1920, a young man will one day come with torn shoes and throw them off. And again, I believe that there was a written documentation of that quote from 1920. I think Yankel Landa wrote it down in his Rishimas. The Rebbe wore torn shoes for 20 years, and he threw them off. And it corresponds almost exactly to the fall of communism. So this is how we understood the story. It's an unbelievable story. And if it's a true story, it's even more unbelievable. Yeah. It's a nice story anyway, but I actually think it's true. In other words, I think that there's what everything I told you before is a fact. That Rabbi Groner said that I heard of one of his nephews, every single time he came back from Nile, they went to Nile very often.
20 years.
For almost 20 years. You didn't change the shoes, and that Everson was afraid to touch her husband's shoes, and there was anybody who could say, excuse me, husband, that Everson could have asked the Rebbe to put on new shoes. There was a reason she didn't ask, or maybe she asked and she was told not to ask again. They had a very, very interesting relationship, the Rebbe and the Rebbeson. It's so interesting. She was the Rebbe's wife, and she took care of him with total dedication and sacrifice. But she was also so careful never to cross him. She was a chassid. She understood that her husband was the Rebbe, and she had to work with him according to his rules, and his rules were, don't help me at all, basically. But that's the story. Now, why am I telling this to you? I'm telling this to you because there's a mysticism here. And the mysticism gets us to the next point. And the point is that when the Eibishter creates a force, right? We believe in spiritual forces. Forgive me for saying it. Stalin was a spiritual force. Hitler was a spiritual force. Napoleon was a spiritual force. Evil forces. But we don't believe that these men were this powerful because they had charisma or because the world was in a difficult situation. We believe that the Eibishter created good and evil, and they're parallel. Mystically, they're good and Zel, ultimately good prevails. But these are individual human beings who are embodied by a higher spirit to fight a certain force. You know, when people like Alexander of Macedonia would call themselves a god, of course it's silly. But there's truth to it. These were human beings who were possessed by unbelievable forces that gave them the will and the courage to be as crazy as they were, because they were really great. They were larger than life. But we believe that it wasn't them that was larger than life. There was the spiritual energy which was embodied within them.
So Hitler was?
Yeah, you know that the day Hitler came to power, 1932, the Belzer Rebbe identified him. The holy Belzadov, he was holiest of holies. He passed away in 1957. The day Hitler came to power, he called him that bad man, or Churchill would call him later. Oy Rusha, that was his official name for Hitler. And he said, Hitler doesn't let me daven, Hitler doesn't learn. Not in 1940, in 1932 and 1933, I can't daven, I can't learn, I can't sit with Hasidim. That evil man, it's unbelievable. 1932, the Belzadov, at that time, no one knew how evil he was going to become because he wasn't seeing him. He saw what he was embodying, something much bigger. There's forces of good, forces of evil. Anyway, the point is that when the Eibishter creates evil, he always creates an antidote. And I have this belief, and I believe that I have a source for it. In other words, I don't think I'm making it up. That in order for the evil to be defeated, the good has to come first. There's always an episode where before the evil even showed itself, the good preceded it. Like it says in Chazal when you get to put him. Hagdamas before Lamaka. Hashem appeals the remedy, the cure before the illness. And that's how I understand this story with the Rebbe Rashab. When the vultures came into the stuff, he said, Ich kem et I can't deal with them. And he basically passed away. But before he passed away, there was a showdown. Purim. He passed away 2 weeks after Purim. Purim was Thursday night. He passed away 2 weeks and 2 days later on Saturday night. He had a Favrengen, and he broke every one of the rules. There was martial law. Martial law means that you could be shot on sight in the street for walking out after the curfew. He had the Chassidim break the curfew. He had the Chassidim sing and dance, which was against the law, to drink alcohol, which was against the law, and raise money. Any one of these crimes, you could have gotten shot for. And the way the story is told is that until midnight, till Chatzos Laila, he was very subdued. He was almost depressed. And suddenly at midnight, he turns to the previous Rebbe and says to Friedrich Rebbe, I don't understand. Simchas Torah, we didn't do this. I want now to be like Simchas Torah. The Friedrich Rebbe went into a panic. The previous Rebbe probably had an understanding that what was going on was very meaningful. He understood this was the end of his father's life. His reaction was, he was very upset. And the Rebbe Rashab said, sing and fabring and put money on the table and bring mashke. So they came in from the KGB. They were called the Checker Guard at that time, where they kept changing their names. They were the NKVD, and they were the KGB, and the Checker Guard, and there's one more that I'm not remembering. Whatever. They were one of the four incarnations of this evil group of people. Came in, and they stood, and he started to humiliate them, to make fun of them, and to mock them. And he spoke in Yiddish, and these were Yevseks, they were Jewish boys, ex-yeshiva bachrim, who were now these big communists, these big atheists. And he said at a certain point, Ich will sagen Chassidus, will sie in ganzen battle werden. I'll say Chassidus, and they'll disappear altogether. And he said the maimed about the erasing of Amalek, the famous maimed that he said. And everybody was sure that the next day he's going to be arrested. They could have shot him. It didn't happen. And 2 weeks later he was gone. And then the previous Rebbe was left to deal with them, you understand? So the way I understand the story is that the Rebbe Rashab was not a part of that. It wasn't his. It was his previous. Friedrich Rebbe lost his life to the Bolsheviks. The Rebbe Rashab was before them, and by him being mevatel them, by him degrading them, by him disregarding them, he created a possibility for their eventual complete collapse. In other words, the mysticism is before they were born, somebody already killed them in principle, so that many, many, many years later their end should come. It's a mystical concept. And there are many parallels for this in Torah, many, many parallels in Torah. And one of them is Moshe. How was Moshe Rabbeinu able to be the redeemer of the Jewish people? Because he had nothing to do with the exile. In fact, he has a link to the pre-exile. Not to the pre-exile of slavery, to the pre-exile of the descent into Egypt. His mother is identified as the daughter of Levi. She was conceived before they left Israel, to say that Moshe Rabbeinu's ability to completely disregard and overcome what the Pharaoh represented, not only physically, but spiritually, is because he was altogether above him. This is the only way to explain why the Redeemer of the Jewish people didn't suffer with them. It's a funny phenomenon. And by the way, if you study Jewish history and Jewish theology, you have contradictions. Sometimes the leaders suffered with everybody. Right? The Gemara says about Mashiach. What's the tragedy of Mashiach? He bleeds. He suffers. Meduka, B'darten, B'chalyenu. The Psukim describe how he suffers because the Jewish people suffering and so forth and so on. And Jewish people sin. But in the case of Moshe Rabbeinu, in other words, different medicines, an essay for different illnesses. But in the case of Moshe Rabbeinu, we learned this in the previous Sichos. The qualification of Moshe Rabbeinu to be the Redeemer is the fact that he had nothing to do whatsoever with the Golos. So now here's a Sichos, which addresses this from a slightly different angle. And I don't have time. So what I'm going to do is, I'm going to finish my introduction and do the actual Sichos next week. So we won't have to rush through it, okay? This Sichos observes two things. There was an idol in Egypt, and there was a decree in Egypt. The idol of Egypt was what? Nile. The river the Nile. What was the decree of Egypt? That the boys should be thrown into the river. Right? I remember we learned the Sichos also, that the girls were kept alive in the spirit of Egypt. The boys were put to death in the river the Nile. What's the concept? The concept that they weren't simply being killed. They were being drowned in what the Egyptians worshipped. They were being drowned in this loyalty, this connectedness to nature as represented by the river the Nile. You understand? Yeah. So here in this Sichos, the Rebbe is going to point out Moshe Rabbeinu himself was placed near or in the river the Nile. Right? We all know the story. Moshe Rabbeinu was born. Right? What's the story? You learn Chumash? What's the story? That the Pharaoh had decreed that any boy born has to be thrown into the river. Originally, it was only Jewish boys. Rashi says in Chumash, the day Moshe Rabbeinu was born, the Pharaoh made an announcement: any boy born any place in Egypt, Jewish or Gentile, should be thrown into the river the Nile and killed. Yocheved was married to Amram. She was, of course, the bright young age of 130 years old, and Amram was her nephew, considerably younger than her, but they got married. And by the way, that would repeat itself in the next generation. Yocheved's daughter was Miriam. She married a guy just about 40 years younger than her. Otherwise, they were very compatible. She was in her 80s, he was in her 40s, they got married. Long story. But Yocheved and Miriam separated. Yocheved and Amram separated, they're divorced. There's even a medrash that says that in between, Yocheved married somebody else and had 2 sons. And Miriam had 2 things to say. Miriam was over 5 years old, understand this, right? She has 2 things to say about it. Number 1, she says, prophetically, Asida imi sheteled ben sheyiyah Mashiach sheyisrael, or something like that. My mother will have a son who will be the Jewish Redeemer. This was a prophecy that she said. And the second thing she said to her father, you are more evil than Pare. Why? Amram was the leader of the generation. Amram divorced Yocheved, all men divorced their wives. No more children, finished. So she says, listen, if you'll have babies, at least the girls will live. If you don't have babies, there won't be any children. So Miriam says, you're killing twice as many Jews as Pare. Pare wants to kill the boys, and you're killing the boys and the girls. So Amram takes her advice. It said the girl was 5.5. Amram takes Miriam's advice and marries Yocheved again. And she gets pregnant right away. Now in Egypt they had the Gestapo, you understand, who would keep track when you got married, and they calculated 9 months. Takes 9 months to have a baby. Yeah, she was 130 years old. What are the chances? But don't worry about that detail at the moment. Yeah. Anyway, so they figured at the end of 9 months, if she's pregnant, they'll check. Moshe Rabbeinu is born after 6 months and a day. So she keeps him home for 89 days until she knows that the Gestapo is coming. You understand? Then she puts him in a little basket and puts him in the river. So the Rebbe observes, it doesn't say she puts him in the river, she puts him next to the river. And then the next pasuk describes that all of a sudden he ends up in the river. And the Rebbe wonders if Bichavet put him near the river, how did he end up inside the river? So the Rebbe brings a Ragachovet that talks about the river of the Nile was an idol. So she couldn't put him in the idol. You're not allowed to save a life by using idol worship. So she puts him next to the river. Until Pare's daughter comes, goes to the mikveh, becomes Jewish, and is mevatal the avodah zarah of Mitzrayim, destroys the idol worship, so that Moshe Rabbeinu is able to be in the river. This Sicha explores the relationship between two things: the defeating of the idol of Egypt, and the breaking the decree about killing the firstborn, killing the sons. That's what the Sicha is about. Or to say it alternatively, the Sicha is really about Moshe Rabbeinu. What kind of presence, what kind of spiritual force did Moshe Rabbeinu bring to Egypt that would allow him to be the Redeemer? And part of what made Moshe Rabbeinu and allowed him to be the Redeemer was his ability to destroy the spiritual evils of Egypt. Okay, and that's the subject on the table. Hold on to your sichos or give them back, and we'll do it next week in Mitzvah Shem.